So if you look here, what I've done is just divide all of the regimes we see in Africa between 4 categories. Minority government, coalitional government, single party plurality, and dominant party government. The picture you might get from the media is that most governments in Africa are actually in the dominant category. But what you can see is that actually 35% fall in the coalition government category. In other words, the most popular category of African country is situations in which presidents need to form multi-party coalitions to be able to manage their legislatures. So right off the bat, this suggests to us that the Latin American literature on coalitional presidentialism may well be very useful for understanding the relationship between African leaders and the legislatures. But there's one very big difference. In the Latin American case, we often see models, Tim Power and others have worked on this themselves, that look at whether or not there's going to be a trade-off within the cabinet between the degree of ideological cohesion, the size of the cabinet. Do presidents want to have bigger cabinets in which they have people from a broader ideological spectrum, but then have difficulty getting consensus over policy? Or do they want to have smaller cabinets with people from fewer parties, finding it easier to get consensus on key issues, but having less votes to actually win in the legislature? Which of these trade-offs do they want to go for? In the African context, we have a good reason for thinking that that trade-off isn't going to be present, because what our MPs consistently tell us is that ideology is irrelevant. And if ideology is irrelevant, then you don't lose anything by forming a bigger cabinet, because it does become harder to get consensus on policy issues because there aren't ideological discussions, there aren't ideological debates. And so here's a quote from an MP in Benin. It says, "Coalitions in Benin last as long as the different actors find their interests," he means their personal interests rather than party interests, satisfied. If they don't have interest, they leave. Coalitions are not ideological. I say they are a grouping of interests, they aren't even really coalitions. So what we assume based on that is that actually presidents in the African context aren't going to think about the same kind of trade-off as they might do in Brazil. They're going to try and form bigger coalitions. And what you'll find when you see Tim's slides later is that our African cases, in our African cases, MPs favour the biggest possible coalitions, or the biggest coalitions of all of the cases in our sample. So in both Benin and Malawi, MPs say that if they were the president, they would form a coalition with 61% of the seats. So they're forming significantly oversized coalitions. And this is because ideology isn't a constraint in these contexts. Okay, so what do we find when we look at Africa? Two of the assumptions that we borrow from the coalition presidentialism literature are that there are certain tools that cost less for presidents than other tools. Right? Using your legislative tools, using your agenda powers as a president doesn't cost you anything. You're given these by the Constitution. Unlike court, where you have to give out resources, unlike cabinet seats, where you have to share power, when you're using your legislative tools, you're actually using them effectively cost-free. So we assume that presidents should want to use these tools more than other tools, other things being equal, if they can get away with them. We also think that presidents may be able to use partisan powers for a relatively lower cost. So presidents enjoy a high level of control over their own parties, undisputed party leader, total control. They may be willing to use partisan powers more because that's lower cost for them than appointing other cabinet ministers to come and join, other parties' ministers to come and join the cabinet. So what I look at in Africa is, okay, what we assume then is that if presidents can, they'll use these two powers to control the parliament, and if these two powers are weak, they'll then substitute in the other tools we've been talking about in order to supplement them to be able to secure enough support in the legislature to win the vote. So do those assumptions hold in the African context? Do we see presidents relying on these two powers and then substituting in other tools when these powers aren't sufficiently strong? And my argument is, and this is very tentative because we don't yet have all of the data from our African countries, and as I said, we don't actually have a literature on Africa, so we're writing this from scratch. But my argument is that we see exactly that pattern in these three countries. So let me talk about partisan powers first. In the three countries that I'm talking about, presidents have roughly similar partisan powers in the sense that they have the same level of control over their parties. In all three countries, the presidents were basically personally financing the party. And because they financed the party, there was very little internal party democracy. Because it's difficult for party activists to hold the leadership to account when all of the funds are coming from the top down, rather than the bottom up. So we see very high levels of personal control over parties. But the ability of presidents to translate that into legislative majorities was much different in the three countries, because the size of their party in power, something Stefano mentioned much earlier, varied dramatically. So if you look here, you can see that in the case of Malawi, President Mluzi, founding president of Malawi after the return to multi-party politics in 1994, controlled 85 of 177 seats. So he was just shy of the majority. He thought, oh, I just need a couple more just to get over the edge, just to ensure that I can't be defeated. But he was in a pretty strong position. He could use his partisan powers much more effectively because his control over his party gave him effective control over a big portion of the legislature. But if you compare that to our two other countries, Benin and Kenya, what you see is that presidents could control their parties, but their parties were so small within the parliament that it didn't actually confer significant influence over them. So if you look, for example, at the case of Benin, you see that the UTRD only controlled 12 of 64 seats, just 18%. If you then look at the case of Kenya, President Kibaki's Democratic Party only won 39 seats. That's just 17%. So although they had equal control over their parties, they had significantly less capacity over the legislature. What about agenda powers, the legislative capacity of presidents to dominate legislatures and to force people to join coalitions or to support legislative coalitions as a result of their legislative powers that are given to them under the Constitution? But what we find is a big difference again between our countries. When it comes to Benin, presidents typically lack the decree powers, the powers to make decisions by bypassing the legislature or ordering the legislature to make decisions on their behalf, that we see in Malawi and Kenya. So what that means is that, and this comes back to what I was talking about earlier, the higher level of democracy in Benin constrains Benin presidents, reducing their legislative powers. So they're in a significantly weaker position in terms of their ability to use their legislative powers to control the coalition. What we also see is that the parliament is significantly stronger in Benin. So not only does the executive lack the power that they have in Kenya and Malawi, but the parliament has significantly more powers of its own. I don't know if you're all familiar with this, but this is the Parliamentary Powers Index. And what the Parliamentary Powers Index does is it adds up the individual powers that each parliament in the world has, and then it creates an index. Now there are many problems with this, one of which is it simply adds up different powers. It doesn't pay attention to the fact that some parliamentary powers, like the power to impeach the president, may be more important than other powers. For example, the power to decide how many support staff there should be in Congress. So it just aggregates across them all. But it's nonetheless interesting for us that in the Benin case, the parliament is seen as being significantly more powerful than it is in the case of Kenya and Malawi. So this is a scale that goes from 0 to 1. 1 is maximum, the highest possible level of parliamentary power, 0 is the lowest. So what we take from this is that presidents in Benin not only have significantly weaker legislative powers, they also have significantly weaker partisan powers than presidents in the other two cases. Now, based on the coalitional presidentialism literature, that gives a very simple hypothesis, that presidents in Benin should be likely to fall on these two core tools. And this is exactly what we find. In the case of both Benin and Kenya, we find that the presidents make more extensive use of cabinet management and budgetary tools compared to the case of Malawi. In other words, the president of Malawi, with those strong partisan tools and those strong agenda tools, is so powerful, they don't need to give much else away. The presidents in Benin and Kenya are fairly weak, and so they must. And just to give you an example of that, if you compare here Malawi and Kenya, in Malawi, President Mluzi never offered his coalition partner, which was called a board, Forum for Democracy, more than 8 cabinet positions. By contrast, when you look at Kenya, the Democratic Party, President Kibaki's party, actually wasn't given the most seats in the cabinet. The rival party, the Liberal Democrat Party, had to be given more seats in his party in order to persuade him to join the coalition, and therefore had 11 seats versus to the 10 seats that President Kibaki's party had. So in the Kenyan case, the president was actually so weak that the cabinet was had to have more of the coalition partners than his own. In the end, his party only held 38% of the cabinet positions. So we see a significant substituting here by President Kibaki of cabinet management because of his weakness on the other tools. Just to show you very quickly that our African MPs say similar things to our MPs in other areas about the things that they think make presidents powerful and the reasons that they join coalitions, but that what we just talked about, the fact that presidents have different tools in different countries and use different mixtures, has a very significant impact on the way that MPs themselves think about coalitional presidentialism. The most obvious way of seeing this is to look at Benin overall. If you look here, you see that when it comes to the most important factor, Benin MPs, like MPs elsewhere, say cabinet positions are the most important reason why parties seek to join the president's coalition. Malawi MPs agree, the most important reason is cabinet position. But if you look at the second most important factor, you see that in Benin, the second most important factor for MPs is to require strategic posts within the legislature for their party. The second most important factor in Benin is not pork, it's not budgets, it's not about formal influence or getting handouts in the executive, it's about the opportunity to gain positions within Parliament. And the reason for that is because Parliament is significantly stronger in the Benin case than it is in the other cases. In the case of Malawi, no MP suggests that that's particularly significant because Parliament is completely dominated by the executive. Instead, in Malawi, the reason people are joining the coalition is because in the context of a dominant president, they want to be able to secure favourable treatment. In other words, they want to get access to things like the ability to get election funds ahead of the next election. So they join the coalition not for those other reasons, but simply to enjoy good relations with the executive. We asked this question in a different way. We asked them, what do you think is the most effective tool for the president to use when forming a coalition? So the previous slide was showing what MPs think is the most important factor for parties when deciding whether or not to join a coalition. This is a slightly different question which says, of the tools that have been identified for managing coalitions, which do you think is the most effective in your country? And what you can see is, again, in the context of Benin, the vast majority of people are saying cabinet posts, as in Malawi, the majority of people are saying cabinet posts, but very different when it comes to the second most popular option. In Benin, MPs say budgetary control, because they're used to a system in which the president, in order to form a majority, always has to make bargains and extend pork. Compare that to Malawi, where the president doesn't need to make these bargains because his executive, legislative powers and his partisan powers are so strong. And what you see is that they place much less emphasis on budgetary control. In Malawi, what's more important is the exchange of favours. Now, the exchange of favours here is a difficult term. It's our term in a sense for brown paper envelopes stuffed with cash. But we had to find a tool, a term that we could use that could be equally translated across all 9 cases. So in each of our countries, this term would have a local colloquial term that would make it easy for people to understand. But we needed a term that we could use across all 9, so we use exchange of favours. But it's basically a proxy for corruption. And what you see here is that in the Malawi case, much more than the Benin case, corruption is significant. The reason this is really interesting is because, again, if we go back to that conception of African politics as being dominated by presidents and riddled with corruption, only 6.7% of MPs in Benin think the exchange of favours makes a difference when it comes to actually your ability to form a coalition. And this is backed up by this quote. If you look at the second quote here from an MP in Benin who says, all presidents use informal and formal means when they want to form a coalition, but the formal means predominate. That's quite a remarkable statement for an African MP. When it comes to Malawi, it's very different. In Malawi, our MPs tell us, and this is a quote you see repeated again and again in interviews in Malawi, to the top leaders, President Malusi offered positions in the cabinet, embassies, parastatals. To most ordinary MPs, he just gave them money, lots and lots of money. Right? Very, very different forms of cabinet management. So what does this mean on how MPs think about coalition presidentialism? Do African MPs think the similar things that they do in the context of, for example, Russia and the Ukraine? Well, we find they do. If you remember back to Paul's presentation, one of his findings is that MPs generally think that it's been good for things like political stability, but not so good for things like democracy. Right? And I'm sure we find lots of examples in Latin America, and Tim will talk about this later, where that's also true. You can see that in this graph behind me. You'll see that when it comes to political stability, MPs in Benin, 83% of them agree that coalitional presidentialism increased stability. But when it comes down here to democracy, only 53% agree it's enhanced democracy. Whereas 45% in Malawi, a minority, agree that it's enhanced democracy there. But what I also want to flag up to you is that we see significant variations in how these MPs answer the questions based on their experience of how presidents actually operate. And that backs up, in a way, our argument that the assumptions you would see in the coalitional presidentialism literature in Brazil hold up in the African context. Most obviously, if you look at things like the representation of diverse social interests, you see that MPs in Benin are significantly more positive about the way that coalitional presidentialisms work than MPs in Malawi. In other words, the evidence here is that MPs find coalitional presidentialism a much more agreeable system when it comes to things like representation and accountability in the context in which presidents don't have dominant legislative powers. When presidents' legislative tools are a bit weaker, MPs tend to be much more supportive of the outcomes of coalitional presidentialism. So, to conclude, what does this all tell us? Well, 4 suggestions. First, presidents in Africa, from this very preliminary study, first look at the data, seem to use the presidential toolbox in similar ways to their counterparts in Latin America and post-communist Europe. Africa doesn't seem so much of an outlier when we put these numbers up compared to the other systems. Number 2, presidents use the tools in a substitutable way, and they use all of the tools, the 5 tools in the toolbox, not just some of them. And significantly, they're consistently forced to bargain with other parties in a way that conventional wisdom wouldn't suggest. What this means is that there's actually significant variation within our countries. Even within these 3 countries that have roughly similar levels of democracy, we find very big differences in the way that presidents engage with legislatures, the nature of cabinet formation, and the type of executive legislative debate that results. And significantly, this matters. And the reason it matters is because we find good reasons to think that not only does this shape executive legislative relations, but it shapes the quality of accountability and the quality of public policy. Thank you very much.